Hello, it's so nice to see you here today. This month we're going to be delving into the world of aquatic legends and myths. I've been thinking about this for a while, ever since back when we were working on tentacles, and I created this piece with these giant tentacles wrapping around my hexagon. I felt like this section of my scroll here needed to have a giant octopus, which sometimes in legend is called a kraken. So that's the name I'm going with. So as usual, I'm going to start out with my drawing, and the way that I'm going to create the illusion of mass of an enormous creature is I'm going to make it extend off the top and off the bottom of my piece of cloth, my long narrow scroll. And in my hexagon, I was able to wrap those tentacles around it so it looks like it's some creature wrapping around it. But in my scroll, I don't think that's going to work. So I'm going to extend the tentacles from side to side, but I'm starting with that body where you can't see the top or the bottom of it. And as usual, I'm just cutting mine out roughly out of cloth. But if it's easier for you to draw some guidelines to follow, then absolutely do that. And now I've got those black vacant eyes, and I really want to create the impression that you're looking into the eyes. Now, of course, I could just sew little squares of cloth on top, but I don't think that that would give it the depth that I was thinking. So I'm going to do something that is called reverse applique. I'm going to put the black cloth on the back of the body, and I'm going to stitch around it and then cut away. And the way that I'm starting that out is I'm making these two little slits that are going to help me to cut away that front fabric later on. And they're not necessary, but I find it easier to do that. So because I've got two eyes, there are two slits. If you've just got one opening, you just need one slit that will let you insert your scissors between the front fabric and the background fabric. Now what I've done is I've put the black cloth behind the orange cloth, and I'm going to sew two ovals into the orange cloth through both layers, through the orange and the black cloth. That's going to secure my eyes. They're going to be the shape of my eyes that I drew out on the cloth. And I'm just going around just sewing through just like you would if you were doing regular applique. If I were working on a regular applique piece, I might have it flipped around so I'm looking at the front, and I'm sewing the big pieces in the front and the small pieces in the back. It's in reverse. That's why it's called reverse applique. And so I'm sewing and using back stitch, so I want it to be fairly secure. I'm just sewing the shape, the round shape off the first eyeball there. I'll go round and round until I get to the beginning. And again, I like the randomness that you get when I don't draw out the guidelines to follow. But if it's easier for you and you like to have guidelines there, then by all means draw them on. And if you actually worked from the back, you could draw them on the back, and then you don't even have to do anything because no one's ever going to see them. Well, I'm using black, so it wouldn't be so easy unless if you had a white marker or a white crayon, wax crayon or something like that that you could draw the lines on. So when I've stitched around the entire circle, and I'm going to do this with both eyeballs, with both eyes, they're side by side. The process is the same with both of them. So I'm only showing you the one here. Once I've sewn all the way around, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my scissors, and I think these are either not sharp or I'm just not good with them. And I do have to just use the tip. I'm going to very carefully cut out just through the top fabric, just through the orange, not through both layers. I'm going to cut out around those lines that I stitch, being really careful to not snip any of my stitches there, just inside the line there. I'm going to cut out that oval, and you can see now how it was much easier to get started when I already had that little slit cut in in the middle there. And then I'll go and do the same with the other one. And then my my black vacant eyes off my Kraken will be showing through the cloth. And because it is in fact behind the orange off the body, it will give the slightest impression that there's some depth there to those eyes, that you are looking into the depths rather than it just sitting on the surface. It's a slight detail. It's not necessary. You could absolutely just sew the little circles on the top, and that would be perfectly good. And I'm going to stitch my octopus Kraken head onto my background cloth, and I can use all kinds of stitches. So I can just use a whip stitch, overhand stitch, just taking a small bite of the cloth, however much I need, just to secure it in place and into the edge of the fabric there. I can also use blanket stitch, and if I wanted to, and it's a straight line, so it would be fairly easy to just turn the edge so you have a folded edge, a clean edge, or instead of the raw edge like that. But I'm not going to worry about it. I like this the scruffy look that you get with just a straight edge there. And now, after I've sewn the body on, I've got a little bit extra here, and I've got a couple of choices there as well. I could just cut it off, trim it off, or I could fold it over towards the back and sew it onto the back. So what I decided to do is stitch along the top there so that it's held securely in place before I trim it off, because if I trim it off first, then things can sort of slide around, and I don't want any of the background cloth to be showing through. So by sewing in place first before I trim it off, at least most of the way until I ran out of thread, I can be sure that I'm trimming right to the edge of the background cloth without going over. And so there you go. There is the head of my Kraken. I'm going to use the same cloth to now cut out some long tentacle shapes. Now, just like the body, my tentacles, I'm going to give them the appearance of great size by having them extend off the end of my cloth. I'm not going to have the whole tentacle attached to the body. You're just going to see part of it. So you'll get the impression that those tentacles go off the cloth and then kind of reappears back onto the cloth. So I've cut out a vague shape off the end of a tentacle, and I'm looking for a good spot to place it there. And I can turn it around in different directions because tentacles tend to be very flexible, so they might be facing up, they might be facing down. I'm giving it some thought. How do I want to place it? And in the end, I decide that, I can have it coming from the bottom over the top, and then I can cut off that last bit, but I'm not going to waste it. I'll still use the extra bit at the top there somewhere else. I can use that in another place, so that again it gives more of an illusion that this isn't just the end of the tentacle goes off the cloth and then comes back down. And again, same thing, I'm just going to go around at the edge of the cloth there. So I'm going to secure the cloth at the bottom, along the bottom edge there. You can use whichever stitch you want. Again, the whip stitch, blanket stitch, or you could even do a straight running stitch if you wanted to. And if you like to have the edges sort of lifting up a little bit, you can absolutely do a running stitch, whatever you feel like. So I've decided that for this side, I'm going to do a blanket stitch, and I don't even have to do the same stitch on both sides. On one side, I could do a blanket stitch, and on the other side, I could do an overhand stitch, and you'll get a slightly different effect. The color of the thread that I'm using will also give a different effect. If I wanted to create a shadow, then I could use a much darker thread, and if I wanted to create a highlight, I can choose a much lighter thread. And if I wanted the thread to blend in, then I could choose a thread that matches the color of my cloth. And all decisions that are entirely up to you to decide how you do this. And I've said it again and again and again. I find that by not planning and not making guidelines and registration marks and lines that I have to follow, it gives my piece a lot of freedom. For example, if I had drawn out the shape of this tentacle right onto my fabric there, then I wouldn't have had the opportunity to decide where I want to place it and make some decisions and alterations to what I was thinking of doing. I would be stuck with the decisions that I'd made in the beginning, but I prefer to make one decision at a time. And you'll see how this plays out in this piece here as I move along. So all I've decided is where to place this tentacle. I don't know where the next tentacle is going to be or what it's going to look like. I'll decide on that as I get there. And as I was doing some research for this month's creatures, because other than the Kraken, I hadn't really decided what I was going to feature for this month. I discovered that, and maybe you know this too, that most of the myths about ocean dwelling creatures or aquatic animals are kind of scary. They're things that sailors were scared of. So the giant octopus, the Kraken, things like giant whales that were real dangers to them as they were sailing out in those actually really quite small ships. And I suppose it makes sense. There were all kinds of dangers and scary things out there that sailors were likely to encounter, and I guess they had lots of long nights with nothing to do but tell stories. And a lot of these myths evolved. But I don't know that animals really have evil intent. Maybe some of those things that they did were misunderstandings, or them just looking for food. And there you can see that I've placed that little tip there that I've cut off, and I'm going to add it on. But first of all, I'm going to make another huge, big tentacle here that is going to go over this area, which was actually the part that to me looked like a tentacle and made me think about doing this giant octopus. And I know it's a little bit funny that I'm covering it up, but it's still there. It is informing what comes on top because I'm using that design there to inform the positioning of my tentacle. So I think that it's all good. So after I finish cutting out this tentacle, I'm going to go ahead and sew it down just the same way that I did the head. And I'm going to cut out more bits of tentacles and sew them on here and there, emerging from off the cloth at the bottom, at the top, and some of them have even ended up tucked in amongst the parts of the scroll that I've done previously. And you'll notice that I've incorporated in some areas the background fabric to look like the underside of the tentacles, and I'm going to add that in here as well, just to show you how I did this. And basically nothing fancy, the same way that I've sewn in all the other parts of these tentacles, just either using a blanket stitch or a whip stitch. And I'll just go all the way around this piece just like I've done on the other pieces. And then it gives a little bit more dimension and looks like you're seeing the underside of some of these tentacles. And on the underside of the tentacles, presumably giant octopi and krakens have suction cups. If you've got a cloth that has little spots on it, that might suggest those sorts of suction cups on the bottom of your tentacles, just with using the cloth. But if you don't, you could always add in some French knots or little beads or perhaps some little buttons. You can do whatever you like. I personally don't like to add beads and buttons because when I'm stitching more onto my cloth, things tend to get all bound up. So that's it for this giant Kraken, and I'm intentionally leaving it somewhat unfinished so that I can add more on top of it and create more depth. There might be some plants in front of it or other objects in front of it. We'll see as time progresses. Anyway, happy stitching, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.